Hello everybody, it's Ranger Mark Mello here with the Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park, and I'd like to welcome you to our 10th Ranger Chat. The Fugitive Slave Act, passed in September of 1850, was controversial to say the least. It mandated that slaves must be returned to their owners in the South, and it made the federal government responsible for finding, returning, and trying these individuals. This act of Congress upset many Northerners, especially those living in Massachusetts. Tensions came to a boiling point when in 1854, Anthony Burns, an escaped slave living in Boston, was captured by federal authorities and returned to the South. After that incident, those living in Massachusetts vowed that no fugitive slave should ever be taken back again from Massachusetts. And that brings us to our story for today. And this week we are going to do a little bit of a throwback as well. We're going to go about 20 plus years into the past and take a look at a segment from an Along the Blackstone episode. And for that, we're going to join former Park Service Rangers Jack Whitaker and Walt Stockholm for the story about how all of these emotions came to a head in Worcester, Massachusetts, in October of 1854.
So Jack, I understand there was an incident right here in Worcester that involved this U.S. Marshal Butman. What do you know about that?
Well, the attempt to save Anthony Burns in Boston, a failure of course, really upset the abolitionists here in the state, particularly the group from Worcester that made the trip all the way into Boston to no avail at all.
Yeah.
So they vowed that it wasn't going to happen again. And vigilance committees were formed throughout the state, one of the more active ones right here in Worcester. And at one point, when Asa Butman, the marshal, arrived in Worcester, they were ready for him. They assumed that there was a target, and they picked one man who had been here in Worcester for 12 years. He was a fugitive slave, left Virginia 12 years before, and been living a prosperous and quiet life here in Worcester. His name was William Jankins. Now, can you tell me anything about William Jankins?
Yeah, William Jankins, as you say, he had been here for 12 years. He had escaped from bondage, moved to Worcester, had settled down. The Worcester Almanac had him listed as a barber, and he worked at the Central Hotel, or I think it was the Central Street Hotel right here in Worcester. Being a barber, he got to shave and give haircuts to a lot of prominent citizens here in Worcester. So he must have known a lot of very important people. He probably was looked to for advice. I think barbers ranked just below ministers in the black community because they did give this advice and counsel to people. So he was quite a well-known man, I would say, here in Worcester.
So the abolitionists here in Worcester would have known him and been very eager to protect him from Asa Butman.
Yes.
I understand as Asa moved into the American Temperance House, it was a hotel here in Worcester.
Yeah, yeah.
That immediately a group of men, about 50 strong, black and white, arrived, and they were going to make Asa's stay a short one and a lively one if they could do anything about it. So they raised quite a ruckus outside the American Temperance House. But Asa was a hard man to scare, and he came to the door brandishing a revolver. Well, this was all the Vigilance Committee needed. He was a flagrant violation of the law, flaunting a pistol. They had him arrested, and he was jailed. The next morning, on the way to court, there was an even bigger mob, screaming and shouting as Asa was brought into the courtroom. The courtroom was bedlam, and Asa began to think better of the deal and decided that he would leave Worcester. He promised he would leave Worcester and never come back again. The abolitionists, led by George Hoare and Stephen Foster, who is the husband of Abby Kelly, immediately turned to the crowd and said, "We've won, we've won." They praised them for the work they had done and said, "We've saved a slave and the slave catcher is leaving town." But Asa's day wasn't over quite yet. I think there were more things to happen to him. Tell us about that, would you?
Yeah, it's interesting. The way I heard the story, as these speeches and all were going on, the crowd was listening to them. At the same time, 4 or 5 black men had broken into the marshal's office where Butman was being held, and they started to beat on him. And it wasn't too long before they were found out, and Stephen Foster came in and I guess, saved him from a worse fate. And they decided right then and there they better get this guy out of town. So they said, let's bring him to the railroad station. And they proceeded through the crowd, being pelted with eggs and whatever else they could find. The whole group was all going still. They wanted this man. Well, what happened when they got to the railroad station, the train had already left for Boston, so here's more trouble for Marshal Butman. So at that point, Stephen Foster decided we better get him out of here. So they hired a carriage and they took him to Boston by way of Westboro, probably never to be seen in Worcester again.
Oh, for Stephen Foster, this was quite a day. You figure he was a man who was an avid abolitionist against slavery. In addition, he was kind of a forerunner of the Gandhi and Martin Luther King school of nonviolent resistance. And to have freed a slave, or not freed a slave, but saved a freed slave, and had a slave catcher run out of town without being seriously harmed. He wasn't killed, and that mob could have killed him. Was quite an accomplishment for him. Asa Butman, his name would go on in history, even long after Asa was around. This incident in Worcester was referred to in the history books as the Butman Riot. And it was the last attempt to enforce the fugitive slave law here in Massachusetts. So that the outcome was that the Vigilance Committee, the abolitionists, had won this one. Massachusetts never again was required to break the fugitive slave law, and a freed slave remained here in Worcester, and a slave catcher was driven out of town.
Good story.
Good story. Well, this is Jack Whitaker.
And this is Walt Stockwell, Park Rangers with the Blackstone River Valley National Heritage Corridor.
See you around the river.
An important story reminding us of the power of people coming together to effect change. Thank you for joining us once again. We will continue to do this in the weeks upcoming, so please, if you have any suggestions or questions, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And as always, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you out there along the Blackstone really soon.